The Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, situated near the town of Pripyat in Ukraine, once symbolized the pinnacle of Soviet engineering and ambition. Constructed in the 1970s, the plant boasted RBMK reactors, a design unique to the Soviet Union. These reactors were chosen for their versatility and power output. Chernobyl's Reactor 4, commissioned in the early 1980s, was one of the most crucial installations, serving as a vital component of the Soviet Union's energy infrastructure. Its purpose was to provide electricity to millions of homes and businesses, contributing to the nation's industrial and economic growth. However, behind the facade of progress lay a series of design flaws and operational errors that would ultimately lead to catastrophe. It all started as a routine test at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. The workers at the plant are a mix of engineers, technicians, and operators who were responsible for keeping the reactor running smoothly. But sometimes they had to do additional procedures for safety tests and drills. The test that was planned was essentially a drill to see how well the reactor could handle a sudden loss of power. They wanted to know if the safety systems would kick in properly if the electricity supply to the reactor suddenly dropped, like it might in a real emergency. And so in preparation for the test, the operators at the plant began decreasing the power from its normal 3,200 megawatts to 1,600 megawatts, where it remained stable and ready to be lowered to its final value for the test, 700 megawatts. But before they could proceed, the phone rings. Officials of the power grid in Kiev say they cannot afford a further reduction in electricity until after midnight, asking for a 10-hour delay before doing the test, to ensure everything on the grid remains up and running. This 10-hour delay would mark the starting point, the first link in the chain of events that would lead to disaster. Competent management would have persisted on postponing the test, but instead it was authorized to continue straight after the 12-hour delay. This delay would cause two problems. One of them was a shift change at midnight. The night shift were not prepared and not trained for the task ahead of them. The second problem was with the reactor only running at half power, which would cause a buildup of xenon-125, a byproduct of nuclear fission. Usually, it's not an issue as it's burnt off when the reactor would be running at its normal 3,200 megawatts, but with the reactor now running at 1,600, it meant that xenon being produced would continue to accumulate for the whole 12 hours, poisoning the core. As men from the night shift entered the control room at Reactor 4, they soon learnt about the test that had been left for them to complete. But many of them had only been on the job for just a few months and were about to do things they had never done before. During this time, Anatoly Dyatlev, the deputy chief engineer, was in charge of the night shift and was eager to complete the safety test which had already been attempted 3 times previously but had failed each time. Receiving the go-ahead from Dyatlov, 2 of the plant workers began reducing the power from 1,600 to 700 megawatts required for the test. But this was something brand new to them, and although having instructions, it was still a complicated task for someone who had never done it before. Out of nowhere, the power started to plummet, diving straight past the 700 target. It reached all the way to 30, indicating a reactor stall. Dyatlov, unpleased with the outcome, demanded that the power be turned back up to 700 so that the test could carry on. An argument within the control room ensued between shift supervisor Alexander Akimov and deputy chief engineer Anatoly Dyatlov. Akimov insisted that he wouldn't increase the power as it was not safe, but Dyatlov was adamant that the test was going to happen tonight, and he would eventually get his way. Reluctantly listening to their superior, Akimov and his young associate began pulling out control rods halfway, which in theory should have given an increase in power because the control rods were made of boron, which decreased reactivity in the core. But the power still wouldn't budge from 30, so they pulled out even more, this time pulling them out all the way. There were 211 control rods in total, and the operators would completely remove 205. After doing this, they would only gain 200 megawatts of power, which was certainly not enough to go through with the test. But regardless to this, Dyatlov again persisted that the test would be completed. Many of the plant workers were carrying out their regular tasks around the other areas of the plant, and practically none of them knew about the test that was now only minutes away. At approximately 1:22 AM, a report comes through from the computer recommending that the reactor be shut down, but this was brushed aside by Dyatlov, and just 30 seconds later he would begin the test. The pumps were switched off, and so water stopped being moved through the reactor. The uranium fuel rods are now left unchecked by the lack of water and lack of control rods. The equilibrium of the reactor instantly switches and reactivity increases. With nothing left to control it, the power surges rapidly out of control, far surpassing its capacity of 3,200. One of the operators lunges towards the emergency stop button, which is a button that exists in every RBMK nuclear reactor. It has just one purpose, to shut down the reactor by first inserting all of the boron rods back into the reactor. But there was one problem that had been completely overlooked. The tips of the control rods were made of a completely different material, graphite, which increases reactivity. The first part of the rods to enter the core are the graphite tips, and when they do, the reaction inside the core that had already been rising skyrockets. This resulted in a steam explosion, as every last molecule of water in the reactor turned to steam instantly, and the pressure became too much. One of the workers who was working in the huge room of reactor number 4 started hearing loud banging and looked down over the railing at the huge steel lid of the reactor to see the control rod capsules, which each weigh 350 kilograms, jumping up and down. He ran to the control room to tell someone what was happening, but before he could get there, the huge steel lid burst open. The second this happened, oxygen rushed into the reactor and combined with hydrogen and the superheated graphite, leading to a huge explosion that would tear through the roof of the plant and spew radioactive material out into the environment, spreading over a large area, affecting regions not only in Ukraine, but also neighbouring countries and even reaching parts of Western Europe. The set of extreme circumstances the Deputy Chief Engineer Dyatlov had put the reactor under was the most anyone had ever pushed a reactor before, and was definitely a prime factor in the cause of the event. But there were more factors than just this alone, such as design flaws in the RBMK reactor and deficiencies in safety culture and training, which were issues that had been overlooked or downplayed for years. Additionally, the pressure to meet production quotas and deadlines, as well as a culture of secrecy and authoritarianism within the Soviet system, created an environment where concerns about safety were often sidelined in favour of meeting industrial and political objectives. 2 plant workers died instantly in the explosion, and 29 more plant workers and firemen would die just months later due to acute radiation sickness. However, the full extent of the casualties would be the many who were subjected to the radioactive fallout and would die years later from cancers, thyroid disorders, and other radiation-related illnesses. The disaster had long-lasting effects for both communities and the environment alike. Evacuated towns such as Pripyat were forced to relocate their populations due to the threat of radioactive contamination. The city of Pripyat, once home to around 49,000 people, was swiftly evacuated in the days following the explosion, with residents instructed to leave behind their belongings and even pets and never returned. The environmental contamination was widespread. Radioactive isotopes released during the explosion spread far beyond the immediate vicinity of Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, contaminating soil, waterways, and wildlife throughout the region. In response to the disaster, extensive efforts were undertaken to mitigate its effect and prevent further harm. A large exclusion zone encompassing an area of approximately 2,600 square kilometers was established around the Chernobyl plant, restricting access to all but essential personnel. Within this zone, measures were implemented to contain and minimize the spread of radioactive contamination, including the construction of a massive concrete sarcophagus to encase the damaged reactor and prevent further release of radiation. Yet amidst the desolation, years later, signs of hope can be found. Nature, resilient and adaptive, has begun to reclaim the abandoned landscape, offering a glimpse of renewal and regeneration in the wake of the world's worst nuclear accident.